This episode explains how, despite a death oath, 11 Mexican Mafia members left the organization and were allowed to live. Like other questions posted by perplexed news viewers that sometimes require episodes to properly explain, this one was incited by a regular commenter. Roy Bell asks, Mundo, I thought you said that Luis Flores from Barrio Hawaiian Gardens died the day after being paroled from Pelican Bay. Here you talk about Flores living out his last years as a quiet family man. Roy Bell is referring to the Top 4 EME Bosses episode. Without elaborating into other details surrounding some of the iconic EME leaders, I can see where this may appear as a contradiction to anyone not familiar. HUERO Buff was the Mexican Mafia's original creator, who spent 34 years as a leader and highly respected man inside this organization. Buff also spent over half his life addicted to heroin. On some occasions, Joe Morgan and I sat with him in his Artesia home discussing and planning EME business while Buff nodded blissfully on his living room couch. Not only did Buff maintain a monster heroin habit, he had the resources to feed this gorilla, purchase multiple properties, enjoy a comfortable life, and perform his duties as an EME carnal. Towards the latter years of his life, out of sheer deference to his tenure and influence, HUERO Buff was one of a few EME members who were allowed to keep a low profile. He absolutely loved his wife and kids, and we recognize his fierce family commitment even back in the 70s. Never did we demand his participation in our street capers because we had things under control and Joe wanted him insulated. I suppose you could call this a code word for protected. But we often did seek his wise counsel. Buff would have put in work if called to do so, but like I said, we had a handle on street operations. Now, before anyone begins to think we were soft, well, maybe we were somewhat. Some of the fellas were just natural favorites, and Buff was one of them. But the mold for EME retirement, or semi-retirement, already had a president. Eddie LOERA was known as Potato Nose from Garrity. Like HUERO Buff, he was one of the 1957 charter members at DVI. He paroled in the late 60s and became the first Mexican Mafia member, to my knowledge, allowed to gracefully bow out of the organization without being called on it. Potato Nose had the following factors in his favor. He was an OG, well loved by the older members, and was not infringing on anyone's territory. He simply chose a life with his wife and kids, and everyone respected this decision. Never did he come to us with his hand out, never did he ask questions about EME business, and he had the blessings of Buff and the rest. The Mexican Mafia death oath clearly requires that the only exit from the organization is to forfeit your life. As I always say, rules are made to be broken. They made them, they can break, modify, ignore, or apply them in any manner they see fit. What can I say? If someone doesn't like it, they can sue them on People's Court. So that mold was broken about 50 years ago. Here is another example of sanctioned retirement from La EME. Through the years, several heavyweight Mexican Mafia members have left the organization and became born-again Christians. Art Conejo Blajos, Conrad Big D Garcia, Juan Green Eyes Gonzalez, Robert Pretty Bob Bustillos, and Ernest Kilroy Roybal were all multiple killers. At the time of each man's change of course in life, all but Kilroy were in very high standing. Kilroy, surely the deadliest of this group, talking sheer numbers alone. Got himself involved in EME politics, but nevertheless he remained well loved by many of the fellas. Although still effective performers to the EME, premature retirement was permitted because God had other plans. If you think about it, any criminal organization prefers willing participants in crime. Because they performed at a high level, never debriefed, never displayed weakness, and were loved by the membership, leaving La EME was justified in spite of the obvious violation of EME rules. Where they were once faithful to Satan, now they are servants of the Lord. Amen to that and continued blessings to them. Please trust when I tell you the chances of you living long enough to enjoy anything remotely resembling a 401 or other EME retirement plan are somewhere between zilch and nada. It just ain't gonna happen. You have a much better chance of being hit by lightning, dying in prison, murdered by your own, or contracting Hep C, or all of the above, than to enjoy the fruits of old age with the blessings of the fellas. With that said, what I have gathered from people in the know is that Alejandro LECHUGA, also known as Hondo from Hawaiian Gardens, has been allowed to enjoy retirement without receiving the ultimate sanction. Hondo is also one of the EME's original members and HUERO Buff's loyal homeboy. As of March 2020, Hondo is 79 years of age and has been a Mexican Mafia member for 63 years of his life. Hondo was a longtime fugitive after escaping in 1969 from the Folsom Ranch, a minimum security facility in Northern California. From heroin and cocaine revenue, Hondo carved out multiple legitimate businesses in Juarez, Mexico, including a string of curio shops used as fronts for his drug operations. The Juarez to El Paso to Los Angeles connection was a route established directly between Hondo and HUERO Buff, supplying the Hawaiian Gardens and Artesia area for many years. Having family in El Paso, Juarez, and other parts of Chihuahua, Mexico, I met with Hondo on different occasions in 1975 at his Avenida Juarez retail store in Juarez. Comfortable and relaxed in his south-of-the-border element, Hondo encouraged any carnales on the run from American justice to seek him out in Juarez. He promised to provide any interested brother with a gun, dope, stake money, a steady job in the drug business in Mexico, a car, and a woman. The only condition was that they could not show their faces in the city of Juarez because their presence would or could generate unwanted heat for him in his endeavors. Some EME members I shared this offer with who became fugitives took him up on it. After I shared Hondo's proposition with a group of fellas in LA, Little SLUGGO Castañeda, an original EME member from Eloyo Maravilla who had just paroled from Folsom Prison, overheard my comments. In an indirect way, this led to events that contributed to Little SLUGGO's heroin overdose death. My upcoming episodes discussing Mexican Mafia nepotism will touch on brothers and family members who become made, and Little SLUGGO's tragic story will be included. There are two other OG members who quietly disassociated themselves from the EME and the life, pursuing a different direction outside the criminal realm. Frank Big SLUGGO Castañeda and Rafael Chispas Sandoval were homeboys from Eloyo Maravilla, made in the 60s and highly esteemed. Chispas became actively involved in community and reform groups, was very active in the church, and pulled his longtime homeboy Big SLUGGO into his circle. With no glorification or bias, as some folks accuse me of, forgive me for using the following term so often in describing most of the big homies, but these men were verifiable multiple-time killers, especially Big Slugs. I mention this because these are facts, and only by dwelling on these facts do many of you see and appreciate the contrast. as I've stated before in other EME episodes. Only then can some folks understand how so many of us, EME, NF, AB, and many other gangs, have been literally saved from the pit of hell and the jaws of eternal damnation. Not because we deserve to be spared, nor because we've somehow earned God's mercy, but only because we surrendered ourselves to the living God, whose Holy Spirit has penetrated us like a deadly sword, slaying our demons, and administering a love and forgiveness we are unworthy of. Thank you for touching Big SLUGGO and CHISPAS, who is with the Lord as I narrate this. Gilbert Shotgun Sanchez from Eloyo Soto was another EME OG who was made in the 1960s and pulled away from the fella sometime in the late 1970s. Bob Harris was his criminal attorney, who also represented Joe Morgan and Robert Salas back in the day. Mr. Harris had a pretty secretary, whose name I will not mention, who fell in love with Shotgun. The two were married, moved to Florida, and lived happily ever after. The surveillance photograph you are viewing is Joe Morgan and Shotgun leaving an LA restaurant sometime in 1973, shortly after Shotgun was acquitted of a murder he committed. Shotgun would ultimately pass away from liver issues. Then there was Carlos Pieface Ortega from Garrity, another OG member who was made in the 60s. Also referred to as Carlitos, he represents a rare instance in which an EME member attempted to leave the organization with their blessing. If you examine the circumstances of the 11 already mentioned subjects, all of them were OGs, put in much work, never turned on their brethren, and none of them were in prison when they received their blessings to drastically decrease their activity and or retire altogether. Pieface fit the same conditions just listed except for one important factor. In late 1972, when the prison war was in progress, he was transferred from Tehachapi back to Folsom, where he awaited his release on parole. It was at Folsom where he asked his fellow carnal and street crime partner Robot Salas from Hazard for permission to exit the organization in good standing. It appears his wife Mary was threatening to leave him if he did not forsake his ties. Robot reminded him in no uncertain terms this could not happen because EME rules mandated hasta la muerte, until death. In an attempt to rehabilitate him, Robot and fellow members sent him on a mission. He was the lookout during the Folsom internal murder of Thomas Elmo Duran, who was stabbed to death by Mundi Varela in February 1973 for not taking care of EME business. It was also an eye-opener for Pieface's foreboding future. Shortly after this incident, Pieface locked up. Today, many of you guys call it checking in. And he later resurfaced as a task force informant and became a prosecution witness in the murder case versus Shotgun Sanchez. After it was discovered he had turned, Pieface earned the derisive nickname La Ballena, the whale, and many of us celebrated Shotgun's acquittal by throwing prison pruno parties where we offered drunken toasts to the insufficient testimony of Carlos Ortega. The jury had been 11-1 for acquittal, with the lone holdout suggesting they flip a coin for her vote. The judge declared a mistrial, and the People versus Gilbert Sanchez never refiled. So there you have it. The mold has been broken and the precedents are historically established. Can a made Mexican Mafia member retire from active mob duty despite having taken the death oath? Hopefully, I didn't burst any bubbles out there because Hollywood and some authors who enjoy giving you Mother Goose stories are probably more interested in hype than serving it straight. At the end of the day, the EME wants willing participants, men who are useful and working with them in ongoing criminal enterprise. These 11 examples demonstrate that you can leave the EME without the posse on your tail, seeking to take you out for breaking one of their sacred reglas, their rules. I am sure they would prefer to see you leave with their blessing than to have you raise your right hand in a court of law against them. None of the men pictured here ever debriefed, locked up, or told on the fellas. One final reminder, do not expect an EME pension plan. It doesn't exist. There are some good questions out there from some of the junkies. Once again, we heard from Mr. Roy Bell, a regular viewer, who touched on an interesting topic. Although I have generally talked about the following topic in my cumulative Perplexed News episodes, the question of why I turned against Joe Morgan and the fellas keeps resurfacing, and maybe I did not touch on this sufficiently. This specific subject will be revisited in the near future. God bless all of you.